So normally corporations make a point to hire competent, knowledgeable employees who can do a good job and make the company look good to consumers. Ever the Maverick, however, Games Workshop has made the brave decision to instead do exactly the opposite. And today, we're going to talk about one of the results. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and I'm here today to talk to you about the most broken stratagem in 40k. Now, before we get into it, I want to preface that I don't mean broken in like a boo-hoo, it's too powerful, I can't win against it way. I mean, to be fair, it is pretty powerful. I mean, in an actual, literal, mechanically impossible way. Like, the words on the card don't work. And that stratagem, I mean, you read a title, so you know, but it's Tremor Shells. So by way of introduction, Tremor Shells is a fun little stratagem attached to the Thunderfire cannon in the Space Marine Codex. Thunderfires, while not as insane as they were before the Doctrine nerf back in February that required Marine armies to progress from the Devastator Doctrine after round 1, are still pretty straightforward point-and-click adventure games. These little boys basically stick 2 to 3 heavy bolters together, increase their range by 2 full feet, shoot them parabolically, and still hit them on a 2+. That's pretty good for basically the cost of the same number of regular heavy bolters, once you factor in that they come with a free tech marine, complete with an expensive servo harness. So altogether, that's pretty strong, but what makes it really great is that Tremor Shells ability, at least theoretically. So let's look at the actual wording of this stratagem and why it doesn't really work. Tremor Shells reads, use this stratagem at the start of your shooting phase, select one Thunderfire cannon model from your army until the end of that phase. When resolving an attack made by that model, subtract 1 from the wound roll, but if a hit is scored, the target is shaken in your opponent's next movement phase. If a unit that cannot fly and is not Titanic is shaken, have its movement characteristic and the result of any advance and charge rolls made for it. So on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Your Thunderfire loads in its special rounds, which aren't as good as actually killing people, and if it hits, it knocks them over and makes them slow to stand up, so unless they're a giant fucking tank or not actually on the ground that's being tremored, they're gonna have to sacrifice some of their movement to get back on their feet.
I've fallen, and I can't get up!
See? Protect yourself with Life Call.
But here's the issue. The effect states that it halves the charge rolls of the tremored unit, but let's read that timing again. The target unit is shaken, and as a result, suffers the movement debuffs we talked about in its next movement phase. As far as I know, no units charge in their movement phase, so this clause in the stratagem is literally pointless. Incidentally, this also means that non-movement phase movement like Quicken, Warp Time, or Hive Commander also isn't affected by Tremor Shells. Oh, you know, my mistake. Actually, this whole video is useless. Yeah, I just realized something. The designers clearly meant for the in-movement phase clause to trigger the start of the shaken status effect and apply the movement debuff. But they forgot to include an end to that status effect. And this is the only place in the entire game that this effect exists, so there's no precedent for when it should expire. So if we're using this particular interpretation, we accept that the clause covering charging is in there for a reason, but have to admit that designers intentionally place an effect that effectively kills the vast majority of units in the game. Melee units are essentially useless once they're Tremor Shelled. And a 1 CP stratagem that can be used twice each turn, tied to an extremely easy to use artillery piece that can be included in any Imperium army for less than 100 points. Now, the way 99% of the community plays this effect and how I'm sure the designers intended it to read is something like this. Use the stratagem at the start of the shooting phase, blah blah blah, until the end of the phase when resolving an attack made by the model, subtract 1 from the rune roll, but if it is scored, the target is shaken from the start of your opponent's next movement phase until the end of that turn. This wording, while it's still extremely powerful, is very reasonable and straightforward. But there's one little issue. There's no concrete way of actually knowing the designer's intent. Theoretically, both of the above interpretations are valid, but neither of them creates the effect that players actually resolve it as during a game. And neither of them truly make sense from a logical standpoint. As far as I know, this issue has not been addressed anywhere by the 40k rules team, and a lot of people aren't even aware of this mistake, despite the literal dozens of Space Marine FAQs that have come out since the Codex's release last year. And without a clear indication of the intent of the stratagem, it's effectively impossible to play correctly, and in competitive play events reverts to the interpretation of an event's TO. Obviously, this is a huge problem because it creates a disconnect between metas or playgroups, or even individual TOs in the same playgroup, and will absolutely lead to negative play experiences between players who interpret the rule different ways. For example, unless it is officially changed, I intend to rule it played as my first interpretation in any events I run, meaning that Tremor Shells has no effect following your movement phase and doesn't impact charges or out of activation movement. I imagine a lot of TOs will implement their own wording and rule it played in the common sense version that I discussed earlier. However, almost all of the TOs I have spoken rule a mixture of the two, that the stratagem does not affect shooting or psychic phase movement, but does still apply in the charge phase and expires at the end of the turn. This requirement to change rules to resolve the designer's grotesque mistakes sets a truly awful precedent, which, if taken to its extreme, means that different 40k metagames begin playing a fundamentally different game than one another. This makes travel and, ultimately, competition fairly impossible. The fact that Tremor Shells has not been addressed by the design team in the baker's dozen of Space Marine FAQs since their release is frankly shocking. Not only is it bad for the game, but it's embarrassing for both Games Workshop and 40k players. Now, I mentioned before that this is an issue endemic to Games Workshop's game design, and I think that's indicative of a much larger issue with the company. Well, ultimately, I think it's a topic for another video. I imagine that issues like this stem from a lack of a development team in their R&D group, who are supposed to catch mistakes like this, but Games Workshop instead is relying on volunteer playtesters to save a few bucks, who are ultimately never going to be as effective as a professional team of developers. In defense of Games Workshop's design, many of their recent rules have been fairly clear-cut, especially when compared to older iterations of their rule sets. But the unacceptably poor wording of an important stratagem in such a recent codex is a clear sign that the problem hasn't yet been solved. Rules loopholes like this drive players from the game, prevent new players from joining the game, and offer shelter to pedantic dickwads who live only to poke gaping holes in rules designed for fair and fun play. And speaking as a pedantic dickwad myself, I think that's a problem that must be addressed for Warhammer to continue its growth into the future. Anyway, that's all for today, folks. Thanks so much for watching, and I do hope this little expose has been illuminating. Remember to check out the channel's new Discord server in the description down below, where you can hang out with other wargamers and join the new T5S2 40k online tournament series. Big thanks to all my patrons over on Patreon. You can check them out at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise and get all sorts of cool benefits if you decide to join them. Things like exclusive videos, early access to videos, and priority seating in T5S2 tournament pods. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and remember to keep it classy, folks. Happy wargaming.